I've known and worked with Matthew for many years. We don't have to go into quite how many. But I learned this afternoon at lunch that he got his MA in experimental psych and his PhD in behavioral science at the University of Rhode Island with Lou Lipset, who is one of the kind of founders of infant psychology. Matthew is jointly appointed in the Bouvé College of Health Sciences. I'm not really clear on how you say Bouvé, but that's my best. And the Khoury College of Computer Science. He is a founding member of the Personal Health Informatics doctoral program, and he directs his own lab, the Computational Behavioral Science Lab. Matthew has won awards, including being named an Aspen Institute Health Scholar, Princeton Lecture Series Fellowship for his career contributions to autism, and Khoury Award for transformative computational science. And it's really the intersection, the confluence of autism and computer science that he's here to talk to us about today. His talk title is The Promises of Wearable Biosensing Technology for Youth with Autism. But to kind of round out the picture, and I'm sure he'll do the same, he has over 25 years of research and clinical experience working with kids and adults on the autism spectrum. He's developed new and innovative technologies for behavioral assessment and intervention. So those include video and audio capture. So some of the things that my lab works with as well, and so that we've had a chance to talk to Matthew about most intensively over the last 5 years or so, but also telemetric physiological monitors. He is really, I think, the world leader on the application of psychophysiology to ASD, accelerometry sensors, and digital video facial recognition systems. So he's published on all those topics. I was just looking and impressed by kind of the degree to which he's used those sensors to better understand repetitive behaviors in autism, but also facial and vocal expression in autism. And just to give you a sense of context, Matthew is famous for his work using biometric sensors, psychophysiology, to predict aggressive behavior in children with ASD. So won't you join me in welcoming Matthew Goodwin?
Thank you so much for the nice introduction and for having me. So how many folks are computational? How many are more developmental clinical? It's about half-half. I'm going to try to appease you both today because I'm a bit of a hybrid of the two. The one additional thing about my background that I would add is I spent 10 years at a place called the Goodwin Center in Providence, Rhode Island, serving about 1,000 families a year with autism, and they tend to skew more to the severely impacted or profound. So some of my interests here in technology, not so much as a panacea, but as additional tools and data and empiricism to try to question working assumptions about why people might be engaging in behavior they're engaging in their absence of being able to explain it to you. So my lab, I call it X-Men Academy. We're a bit of mutants. I have developmentalists, I have cognitive psychologists, behavioral psychologists, computational engineering folks, data visualization. I really like the kind of team science approach to trying to think about how do we better understand, support, and evaluate human development. For those who don't know much about autism, the highlights I want to give you is when I got into the field, it was 1 in 10,000. As of the CDC's last report a couple of months ago, it's 1 in 36. Has no known biomarker. We don't understand why it's occurring at a higher rate. It's highly heterogeneous. Many individuals can have the same diagnostic label, but express very differently. There seems to be a continuum of abilities from very high to those who are more challenged. We tend to, when you look at the published literature, of which we have enormous amount now in autism, and you go to the methods section and the participant section, and you look at the demographics, they tend to be normal IQ, high verbal fluency, that more able end of the autism spectrum. The 30 to 50%, depending on which metric you use and which data, of that autism population is minimally verbal, intellectually impaired or engages in challenging behaviors, which I'll define better later on. Clinically, it's the more severely impacted who are underserved. They're also understudied. And I think in part it's because we invoke Yuri Bronfenbrenner and developmental science, laboratory-based research, which is where most of us like to have good experimental control when we're doing observations, are in fact strange places with strange people doing tasks you've never done before for ill-defined periods of time, and you're expected to act naturally. Many individuals who have that more severe profile of autism can't accommodate that kind of transportation or kind of regulation in those settings. And so I fear that those we need to help the most, we have the least amount of scientific data to understand what's working and what's not working when we attempt to intervene. I've also seen in many situations where people will do studies and they'll take a larger sample of autism and they'll take an average. But we know about ecological fallacies, we know about the ergodic theorems, we know that not any one individual may be represented by that average. And so there's likely some of the heterogeneity that we see in autism. We're washing out individual differences because that's noise, because we're assuming that there's one thing that we're studying. I, in fact, think that we're studying thousands of millions of different things that have a common endophenotype. I'm trying to give you some of this as motivation for why the methods apply. Several different systems within autism are affected. If you look at one, you'll say this is a cognitive disorder. If you look at another, you say it's an affective disorder. If you look at another, you say it's a motor disorder. If you look at another, you'll say it's a biomedical. I think they're all right. Well, one has to add those levels together within an individual, I think, to understand why people might be expressing the behavior or aptitudes that they do. It's a developmental disorder by definition, but it doesn't change uniformly. We have children who are slow for development. We have those who make gains and plateau. We have those who catch up. We have those who may make gains and then lose some of those gains, which means we need repeated measures. Heisenberg principle, if you have people following you around, recording you and talking about you and you can hear them, might be actually shaping the behavior of their response inadvertently, and you're not measuring that, so you don't know how much your presence is affecting their behavior. And then kind of lab to world. Science is good for internal validity, but how well that generalizes in other settings, context, time, affective states. We don't often measure behavior in the places where it's naturally occurring over time. And so I think we can sometimes use heuristics that capture an individual's abilities or inabilities, but we haven't actually observed them in a multitude of settings. All of these reasons for me is why I thought wouldn't it be nice if we could get out of the lab and into the world? And essentially the shortcut would be, can we instrument people? Can we instrument spaces and do real world data observations that generate multivariate intensive longitudinal data? And so early on, I did a postdoc at MIT and started to learn about wearable computing and ubiquitous computing. And I got really excited talking to engineers to think about the things that you can measure on body, like your motion, like your cardiovascular, your sweating rate, the things that we can learn from ubiquitous cameras, microphones, radio frequency ID. If we could put these together, could we instrument the environment and instrument the person? Would we be able to reduce reactivity to measurement, increase compliance, increase ecological validity, look at multivariate interactions between data, use data visualization as a way to generate new hypotheses that you might want to interrogate further? And to the extent to which there's a signal that you can identify that you know is actionable, can we provide just-in-time clinical support or assistive technology interactions based on real-time data? For those who are more kind of data oriented, within behavioral, social, medical science, this is Cattell's data cube. P is the number of people, X are the number of variables, T is the number of time. We focus very much on what we call a nomothetic. We're looking for averages. We're looking for laws. We tend to do large numbers of people, large number of variables, but very few points in time. If we're interested in development, if we're interested in individual patients and their life course, it's interesting to know what's happening in the general population, but I'm really more interested in using that individual to serve as their own control over time, measuring a lot of things of a lot of intensive time points, generalization not to another person, generalization to that specific individual. One way you could think about this is an inch wide, mile deep versus a mile wide and an inch deep. I think we spent a lot of time mile wide, inch deep. And it's good, it's taught us things, but I think the next revolution is going to be intensive longitudinal repeated within an individual. And if one can do that, we have much more data to characterize patterns over time. We are getting closer to proximal events and behavior and connecting those up in the absence of somebody telling you what their experience is like. And I know it's the holy grail, but temporal precedent is a foundation for causal inference. So we can move away just from correlation and association. We may be able to drive a little deeper into mechanism. Leo Kanner, Hans Asperger, 1944, were describing the same patients. They were writing in two different languages. They were not reading each other's work. They had surprisingly consistent descriptions of what we would come to call autism. It's the last point that for 20 some odd years, I've been really interested in thinking about these behaviors that we call autistic or abnormal may serve a function. They may have an adaptive utility, and they may be responsive to things that the rest of us are not necessarily affected by. I know that's vague in general, and that's on purpose because I'm going to now jump into some applied examples to better illustrate what I mean. So this first area is what Daniel was talking about in repetitive motor movement, stereotypy. This is one of the two diagnostic classifiers for autism. We have social emotional, and then we have restricted and repetitive behavior, and we have secondary for sensory and anxiety. Hand flapping, I'm talking about motor mannerisms now. So hand flapping, body rocking, and finger flicking are what we see as the most common across the population. Now, just interestingly, like right for a second, of all the things you can do with your body, why these three things? When you read the literature, because I was looking for a consensus definition, what do we mean by stereotype mannerism? These are not fixed action patterns. These are voluntary behaviors. The consensus definition is that they're invariant in form. Every time they do it, they look the same without any obvious eliciting stimulus. It's not clear to the observer what's happened in the environment that may have occasioned the behavior, and that it has no adaptive function, right? We can't understand why they're employing this behavior willfully. But when you really look at the literature for which these characteristics are based, they're mice, rats, cats, pigs, and non-human primates who are engaging in anthropomorphically similar behaviors. And we're saying, well, this must be what's happening in autism. Now, I, based on clinical experience, and now I have data to challenge this, think all three of these are incorrect. But one has to demonstrate through data and reinterpretation of what we thought versus what we now can observe, whether these characteristics actually give you any explanatory ability. So for those who have not seen what I'm talking about, these are 4 different individuals, all diagnosed with autism, all engaging in the same class of behavior that we would call restricted and repetitive. You feel like you have a good enough sample there of what you see? So these are clinically significant, right? When you engage in this behavior, you tend to do it for high periods of time. If someone tries to interrupt you or get you to stop, people can become anxious, agitated, and aggressive. It's socially stigmatizing. As soon as you're doing this behavior, you're communicating to others in the environment that you are not of typical development. It interferes with your ability to demonstrate skills you have. I think people assume that you're less able than you may be. And if you're not socially connecting with other people, you're not invited to do so because you're of the stigma, you're not getting opportunities for normalization, for learning and skill acquisition. You're also not demonstrating to society that you're not a threat and it's okay for you, sort of desensitizing social behavior. And we've seen in some instances where a relatively innocuous behavior can actually start to turn into a self-directed injurious behavior. And those are much more difficult to manage. I'll come back to that in just one second. Most of the research uses surveys, presence, absence. Is it problematic and to what degree? So that's good. That's a good start, but we don't fill out that survey repeatedly, instantly. And so as a result, we don't know about inter-individual change in its form, in its amount, or in its duration. That's added information if I want to know something about function. Come back to that in a second. Direct observation. So two people can observe the child at the same moment, and they're going to do inter-rater reliability. The highest inter-rater reliability I've seen in the published literature for live is 33%. Think about this. Two people turn their back and guess, they have a 50% chance of agreement. These happen very fast. They transition. It's incredibly attention demanding to do that at fidelity. You can videotape these behaviors. You can code them frame by frame. You can get very high inter-rater accuracy. And I'll tell you, after 4 years of doctoral work, I would never wish that task upon anybody. It is incredibly boring. It requires a lot of attention. It takes so much more time than the actual length of the video to code everything. What I was interested at this time was, could we use, so accelerometers had just come out. This is pre-Fitbit. For those who don't know, an accelerometer is recording gravitational force in X, Y, Z, so three-dimensional space. It's what's in your phones. That's how it knows portrait or landscape. That's what's doing the step counting in your Fitbit. If we could place these on the bodies of individuals with some initial training about what is a flap, what is a rock, what is a finger flick, could we use machine learning classifiers to do automated detection of these behaviors? Now, the reason why I got kind of obsessed with the resolution of measurement was, we don't really know if these behaviors are changing over time or not when you just have a global survey. Parents don't have that level of recall or resolution to really tell you. There have been several competing theories about why these behaviors occur. I mean, one is the first I showed you, the non-adaptive, but some would suggest that these are learned behaviors. In the absence of communication, when I engage in these behaviors, you approach or you leave me alone. So you might be instrumental to something I would like you to do by virtue of me being able to engage in a motor activity. There's been suggestions of homeostasis, homeostatic regulation. So if an individual is stressed, this may actually bring down autonomic function and be calming. If I'm not getting enough stimulation, I can create it. There have been theories about somatosensory. So one might be upregulating or downregulating the amount of environmental sensation that they are receiving. Some have suggested, I haven't seen data on this, but more self-reports, proprioceptive. They feel their body better in space and time when they're moving than when they're just still. Guiding more personalized interventions, documenting outcomes, comparing and contrasting these motor features with other neurodevelopmental disorders that have this as a feature, understanding underlying pathophysiology. I would argue that having a very good but efficient baseline is necessary in order to achieve any of those affordances, because one needs to understand, are these behaviors staying the same or are they changing across time, environment, affective state, demand, physiology. I hope to make this even more clear in a moment. So this is an individual with autism. He's in his natural classroom. He's got an accelerometer on his left wrist, his right wrist, and on his torso. This is left wrist, this is right wrist, this is torso. They're 3-axis. That's why you see 3 different lines. The video is timestamped with the head of these time series. This is the offline record frame by frame coded by RAs. So we know the topography, we know the onset, and we know the offset. You'll see when he flaps his hands, you get bursts of activity in the left and the right. You see a little bit in the torso, but most of the velocity and the magnitude is happening at the wrist level. Can you all see what I'm pointing at? When he's not engaging in a repetitive movement, you'll see relatively flat lines or lines that are distinguishable from those when he is. I just want to wait 1 second because I want you to see a rock. Sinusoidal waves in the torso stream start right here. Now, what I'm going to show you afterwards is we basically feed 50 examples of these labeled data. And then the class C4-5 decision tree classifier ultimately had the best results, and that's what we used. is then going to take the unlabeled data. And the question is, how often is it identifying any repetitive behavior, a flap versus a rock versus a simultaneous between the two? But something that I think is really interesting about this kinematic data, if I had a clever way to cover that video, you should be able to tell me based on this brief exposure, is he engaging in a repetitive movement? And if so, which one? But you can also say, maybe I should stay by the mic. How long did it last? How intense was it? What was the periodicity or stochasticism between an offset of one and an offset or an onset to the other? What is the transition pattern between going from a rock offset to a hand to back again of recursiveness? There's information embedded in the signal itself that we might be able to use to parameterize whether something is staying the same or if it's changing, or potentially something about the function if you have other contextual information. So in this first study, basically with 50 examples, we were able to get on average 90% accuracy of the classifier to unlabeled data across these 6 different individuals. So it's an 85% true positive rate, it was an 8% false positive rate, and I'm showing you Cohen's kappa. That's the accounting for a chance agreement in the inter-observer. This is using one model with leave one out. We see a range between 95% accuracy and 17% accuracy for some individuals. I revisited the same sample 3 years later, recollected data, because I was curious about if we use study 1's data to test on study 2, how much can we say about whether these behaviors are changing over time, and or how much do we need to do classifier retraining because we've got drift from their original feature to what they're doing now. Interestingly, and this was also an attempt to now quantify what do we mean by intensity, duration, and estimated movement frequency, so that we can now parameterize these so not just a recognition task, but a characterization task. The gray cells are significant, white cells are not. For a subset of these individuals, these behaviors are changing over time. For a subset, they're not. And this is a common intervention target point in a lot of clinical settings because of the stigma associated with it. This was the first time I had done this. I've seen people in computer vision do this quite a bit, but I made, not the videos because they're identifying, but I made the video records, the annotations from human, the raw acceleration data, and the code that we used to do the recognition, the classification, publicly available in a UbiComp data set. About 4 months later, a research group in Janssen Research and Development in the Netherlands had downloaded my data, had reproduced our results, had tried recurrence quantization analysis, wrote back to me and said, we can do a 9% increase on overall accuracy using one of your sensors, not even all 3, reducing the burden on the participants to give the data. And we can do this with person-independent classification. We don't need to use your global model and leave everybody out. Wrote to me, said, here's our code, you rerun it, confirm that you get the same results, and then co-author a paper together. I didn't have to worry about getting scooped. I know to the data scientists, this is not new. To the behavioral scientists, this is like my new cheerleading thing. My case is your control. I know about data because I collected it for a certain purpose. That may serve a different purpose for you. You know about different methods that I don't know about that may extract more utility out of that data than I approached it with. This democratization of data, I think, is a great idea. We don't do it, I think, because we're worried about credit and authorship. I think these times are changing. We got to change with it. Further extension, subset. So these are 10 individuals. We also had cardiovascular, respiratory, and motor activity. I wanted to test explicitly that homeostatic interpretation. And interestingly, over all 10 individuals across rocking, flapping, doing both simultaneously, we saw the same curvature in their cardiovascular somatic coupling for each class of behavior and all individuals, such that this is actually more informative. So this is heart period. Psychophysiologists like heart period. We think about heart rate. Heart period is the inverse of heart rate. As this goes down, the heart is increasing. As this goes up, the heart is slowing down. For all 10 people, all classes of behavior, heart rate is increasing 4 seconds prior to the onset of the behavior. While they're engaging in the behavior, heart rate is slowing. Once you get an offset of the behavior, once the cardiovascular starts to come back up to its baseline, you get an offset of the behavior, and the post-baseline is statistically significantly lower than the pre-onset period. You all with me? Thank you. Which says to me, you cannot rule out, I am not suggesting that everybody is engaging in this behavior for homeostatic regulation, but this is evidence that that may be happening for some individuals. Now, there's more control we want to do for this. I don't have, we need the full, how does body mass index affect this relationship? How does the breathing rate before, during, while they're doing it? Are they holding their breath? I mean, we would want to interrogate this a little bit further. But I like this as an example of, let's not assume we know why they're doing it. It doesn't have a function. We should intervene because we think we're helping them. Think about a population where the world isn't built for you. You have an impoverished coping repertoire. This is one way that you regulate your stress in the world. I think all of us would agree that that's essential to survival and thriving. And people are telling you to stop doing it. Are we helping in that instance, or are we actually doing more harm? I'm going to switch. I know I talk fast because I want to share so much with you in a short period of time. If you aggress to another person, if you self-injure, if you destroy property, if you elope, get up and flee without warning, you become a threat to yourself, a threat to somebody else, right? I've talked to many families of children with autism who display these behaviors, and often they'll say three really kind of key things. One, they don't know why they do it, and they can't predict when it's going to happen. Two, it restricts what they do with their child. They don't go to church, they don't go to the movies, they don't go to restaurants. They are voluntarily restricting the amount of exposure that they have to other people. And that most of them are really concerned and stressed about this behavior. We really saw it during the pandemic when we lost face-to-face contact. These families have higher divorce rates, they have higher substance abuse, they have higher mental health issues. And what they'll say is, look, I can accept my child has autism. I accept that they have special learning needs, and I accept that this is going to be a lifetime of support I have to provide. But it's really hard to fear that they're going to injure me, they're going to injure my other child, they're going to injure their teachers, they're going to injure support staff. You see higher staff turnover in professions that are working with this population. You see more injuries, you see more reimbursement being requested. We don't pay people enough to provide the kind of supports that are required for these individuals. 2/3 of individuals with autism who display aggression, this is a reason why they get referred to behavioral healthcare services. Many of these individuals will end up using emergency rooms, which are not set for sustained clinical support. And then if we still don't get good results based on interventions, they'll end up in psychiatric inpatient settings, and then may end up in lifelong residential special accommodation. This is especially difficult in the 30 to 40% of individuals who have no verbal or minimal verbal ability. There have been a variety of different factors that we think relating to issues with emotion regulation in terms of language ability and receptive ability, cognitive rigidity, executive function, lower inhibition problems. It's the biological that I want to kind of have us focus on and visit for just a second. So the traditional interpretation of these behaviors in the literature has been escape, maintained, avoidant, oppositional, defiant, and forensic. And after spending a lot of time with kids who engage in these behaviors, I really started to think, like, what if we go back to a more basic principle and we think about fight or flight. If the world is not easily predictable to you, but you have to manage in it, there's a higher likelihood that you are hypervigilant. But if you have relatively flat affect and you don't have the words to communicate, and we're not thinking of things as being potential stressors, and our job is to teach them things. Sit down, look at me, go back and attend to your task. And this individual has a migraine, they have reflux, they didn't sleep the night before, there's a subclinical seizure, there's a variety, they're not, I always like this experiment. So you hear the fan and the projector, you didn't before I asked you that, and you won't again as you continue to listen to me, because your brain knows it's not adding any new information. So we habituate and it goes away. What if your brain doesn't do that? So now it's got to compete with the flicker rate of the lights. It can't get that sound out. I'm talking from over here and it's a jumble because their brain is not bringing all of that information into one clear channel that they can interpret. That's background noise to any demand that you're trying to place on them. That's overwhelmingly taxing to the nervous system. And so part of what the kind of rationale for this approach was, if equilibrium is broken from a distressor, and I can soothe myself or somebody else can soothe me, I don't need to engage in this behavior. But if I can't soothe myself and you can't soothe me, and the threat or the distress is still there, if I aggress, typically I'm going to get removed from that setting, or somebody is going to come to my aid. I'm essentially recruiting other people to back away, or to take me out of that environment. That would serve the same thing that any reptile or mammal would do if they thought that safety was threatened. So the hypothesis was that physiological arousal may be preceding, not solely concomitant with, these challenging behaviors. And so what we wanted to see was, could we predict the proximal onset of an aggression using physiological data from the contemporaneous and slowly into the past, using wearable sensing and machine learning algorithms. Very fortunately, the Simons Foundation had run a what they call the Autism Inpatient Collection. So a variety of different sites around the country that have psychiatric inpatient where they receive high rates of autism. They're doing standardized diagnostic assessments, autism measures, and then blood draws, because they're trying to create more biosamples for genetic researchers to have more representation in their data sets. Well, this seemed like a really interesting place because it's staffed 24/7. These are dangerous behaviors. You can't just ignore them. You can't ethically elicit them. Where we could introduce biosensors so that the inpatient children in this case are wearing the biosensor. There are staff around who we've given, sorry, here's the biosensor. So this is the E4 Bioempatica. I'm a scientific advisor to the company. I'm not asking you to buy these. In fact, they're sunsetting them, so you couldn't even if you wanted to. This is recording electrodermal activity. That's a sympathetic measure of sweat, eccrine sweat glands. This is not just thermoregulatory. This is also about affect salience and cognition and stress. It's recording heart rate and heart rate variability through photoplasmography. So that's shining lights underneath on top of the wrist. The refraction rate, oxygen has a different refraction rate in the bloodstream. So this is blood volume pulse. We can get that time series out. 3-axis accelerometry and temperature. And it's shockproof and waterproof. So this was a safe device to put into this setting. And then we give the staff a mobile phone that is time synchronized with the sensor clock. And then we're asking them opportunistically, when you see an aggression, a self-injurious behavior, we call it emotion dysregulation, toggle that, hit it when it started, hit it again when it's off. That's now providing us with event markings about periods of time when they're engaging in those challenging behaviors and then they're not. And then this becomes a machine learning task. Can we derive features that are prodromal to the behavior? Well, first, can we find the hyperplane between when there is a challenging behavior, when there isn't? And then for the periods that they are there features in a sliding window that we can identify, either some canonical form or how that data is changing over time leading up to that event that might be predictive of, so basically it's being recorded in real time. we're analyzing it offline, but we don't have to simulate anything because it's real data. And then see how far essentially into the past do we need to go to make a prediction how far into the future at what % accuracy. Go with me? Cool. So our first outing with this was 20 individuals with autism, 69 independent naturalistic observations. These tended to be between 1 and 4 hours per session. And we, using ridge regularized logistic regression, found that we could predict these behaviors a minute before they occur using 3 minutes of prior data. This is continuous data. 71% accuracy if you train the model on everybody and leave one out, and 84% average accuracy if you do person-dependent classification. All still with me? Cool. Subsequent to that, we then continued across 4 different clinical sites, 70 new individuals with autism in the inpatient setting. That's 429 data collection sessions. That's over 500 hours of data where you have human annotated onset, offset, and topography with concurrent biosensor data. And we saw 6,665 naturally emitted challenging behaviors within the corpus. You'll see the distribution. So that's about 10% aggression, 30% what we might call tantrums or meltdowns, 60% self-injurious behavior. I know this is complicated. We'll go to each panel. So overall, we are able to predict these behaviors 3 minutes now, as we have more data, enrich this data set, 3 minutes in advance with about 80% average accuracy. These are ROC curves if you look at combined. So we're not making a distinction between subclass. It's just any challenging behavior. These are directly, you think about these as accuracy for each of the subclasses. We also used the accelerometry area under the curve as magnitude as a proxy for intensity of these behaviors. Right, so how forceful or how strong so low intensity, medium intensity, the really important ones where people hurt themselves or they hurt other people, we're doing the best at. We're catching those. And then we look within individuals where we have repeated assessments and we have and maintain this accuracy over time. So you can think of this as test retest or stability. Once the classifier is trained, as you do repeated sessions and you give it new session data it hasn't seen yet, it seems to perform just as well as it did on the data that you had already provided labels for. And then what I'm showing you here is it's not just motion. It's also the blood volume pulse and the EDA that is explaining some of this variance in the prediction. And so there was some question, right, I had very early on, maybe we could just get this with motor activity. Maybe you could just get this through the human annotation labels because you're building up some kind of behavioral momentum that you could pick up on. And it appears that the physiological measures are contributing to the feature set that is predictive of the onset of these behaviors.
Could you tell us hours to see the top line figure to see? Is there something?
This would be the contribution of the motion features. How much they're moving is predictive of, so it might start as something like kind of mild that turns into a punch or self-injury. You just push back. It's always a problem with fancy data viz that I didn't create, that I used with somebody else. My understanding is this axis is this curve. This axis is this curve. And this is composed of a couple different measures because we're combining EDA plus blood volume pulse, and you've got derivatives of that. So like the variance of those. This is just area under the curve. So we're taking a 3-axis and we're just saying what's the magnitude over. Two things that are happening now. So, and they're happening in parallel. We just recently got a new award that opens up a collaboration with the Marcus Autism Center at Emory University. We're going to deploy these same sensors now in the context of functional analysis of behavior. So they're eliciting these behaviors, trying to make a determination about whether the aggression, the self-injury, the property destruction is socially mediated or is automatically reinforced. I'm curious to see if that determination is an added feature that helps us with our prediction time and our accuracy. They're also videotaping all of those sessions, and we're going to be doing computer vision analysis to see if we can spot when the behavior is happening, differentiate the topography from self, other to property. One of the biggest limiting factors with those functional analysis, it takes an enormous amount of time for staff to sit and annotate that whole data set. So they're getting this information, they're subsampling it usually for studies, but they're not using it in the clinical workflow because it takes too long to process all the data. And I would be curious if we can automate with decent detection rates of topography, onset, offset, duration. It'd be really nice if we could get magnitude too. I don't need humans to do the behavior observation labels in order for the classifier to learn based on the biosensor. You could close that loop. And then on the other end of this is developing systems now where we can try to push just-in-time notifications and adaptive feedback. 3 minutes is enough time to potentially do something, to stop whatever you're doing. So you could feed that back to the individual, right? If they have the cognitive ability to say you're starting to lose it, there might be a set of things that you would like to coach them or teach them to do to try to regain that control. Or for a caregiver in that environment, stop what you're doing, attend, get ready, make sure things are safe, maybe try to de-escalate them, redirect their attention, there are likely many different reasons why physiology changes that precedes behavior. And there are likely several different types of interventions that are effective differentially for different people. What I would be curious is if a system is deployed like this that provides a just-in-time function so people aren't caught off guard. They can be proactive. They can be empowered to try to manage the situation instead of reactive and crisis management. And I'll tell you, when a kid's coming at you like this, it's not a learning opportunity. You're not thinking about why might they be doing this. You're getting ready to defend yourself. Most of these behaviors, we have helmets on kids. They have mechanical restraints, so they can't do it. We medicate them. You can reduce those rates by those interventions, but those aren't scalable. And the medications are not acting on specific parts of the brain. They're sedating them. And so you're missing all of the other affordances of attention and working memory and kind of social interest. I also think an interesting future might be, so basically bringing all of these classifiers online, running them in real time, having push notification, so that people can then preemptively act on that information. And then we learn over time what worked and didn't work about their intervention so that the next family that comes along that is getting this data, the dream would be that you're developing a data warehouse where you can layer on other information that we know about the individual, where we can start to do subtyping about what might be the putative cause and what might be the best match for intervention in a prospective way instead of trial and error and all. I've seen kids denucleate their eyes, chew off lips. Really injure, grab hair and break people's neck bones. These are scary. And I don't know that it ever needs to, I shouldn't say ever, but I'm not sure in all instances it has to go that far. And we certainly don't have enough care facilities to help everybody who has an issue like that. So the extent to which we could try to keep people in their homes longer, in their schools longer, in their community health situations longer, I think one of the biggest complications is we don't know that there's a problem until it's too late to really do anything about it. We're on our heels. I think there's also a kind of a cool opportunity for IoT. So if an environment got the output from these classifiers, could it lock or unlock doors? Could it dim or brighten lights? Could it occasion music or sounds? Could it make a if then that other response to something else in the environment? I'm going off on a tangent right now, but I'll be quick about it. We don't have enough care professionals for the number of people who require assistance. Even if we did, I don't know that 24/7 monitoring is good for self-determination and self-esteem. We need to help people in the moments that they need it and leave them alone in the moments when they can learn and thrive on their own. And so somewhere here, I'm hoping that this is an example where we can start thinking about giving tools to health professionals that extends their reach, and that they're seeing more people and supporting more people at a distance, but only in the times when they're needed. We're not spending resources when they're not needed that are draining resources going to those who are not getting enough support. Super quick, short plug. I know Daniel's interested in this. Most of us, when we think about physiology, we think about within an individual. There seems to be a phenomenon of interpersonal or dyadic physiology that subserves affiliative and social behavior. We see this in mothers and infants, you see it in romantic couples, you see it in clients and therapists, you see it in jobs and bosses and employees, you see it in conductors and orchestras, coaches. And so we did a systematic review of this because I was really curious about, like, is this something that is explaining some sort of variance that we care about in terms of social behavior? And what we sort of walked away with was the more two people's nervous systems coordinate tends to explain variance in what we call empathy, attunement, engagement, entrainment. There have been 2 studies in autism that have tried this methodology. Both found that it was predictive of social responsibility or social function. I think this would be a really cool thing to do at a bigger scale. This is a total teaser. It's one picture. It's one dyad. Please don't extract too much meaning, but I want to kind of make a point. So this is in my lab. The gentleman is the test administrator. They're doing the autism diagnostic observation schedule. On the right is mom. On the bottom is a boy suggested of autism. The top time series, this is all electrodromal activity from device that each of the 3 people are wearing on their wrist. The examiner is working hard the whole time, right? He's trying to engage this child in social bids and get an interaction going. So he has enough of a social repertoire to say whether he thinks he has autism or not. The parent is next. Her physiology is high as the child's physiology is low. The examiner is trying to engage the child and the child is not engaging. And mom's like, this isn't good. My kid's not doing what he wants him to do. And then he gets engagement from the child. And then mom's arousal comes back down. And then he loses it. And then mom starts to go back up. What the point I want to make about this, I mean, we have a much larger data set. We're starting to get this organized. We're going to look at this more systematically. We have 20 kids with autism, 20 typically developing, age, sex match. We have social responsiveness scores on each of them. The subset we've looked at, we can predict 60 to 70% of the SRS score based on whether there's physiological synchrony between the child and the examiner versus the child and the parent. But think about this for a second. The parent's physiology is a proxy for the child's behavior. And these are coupled systems. We spend so much time focusing on the child, measuring their behavior and their biology, and we are not spending equal amount of time about the people that they're relating to, or what heuristics is the diagnostician following that gives them an idea about whether they're concerned about this child. That's another unit of analysis that I think we might learn something from. So I like this idea of essential relational physiology and what use could it be. My understanding is we should be able to see this come online sooner than 36 months when you have enough language that we can say we're confident in a diagnosis. I don't have reason that I have seen for electrodromal activity or cardiovascular function to be different in autism in early childhood than it is later. So do we have a potential digital biomarker that could be used at kind of a level 1 screening about most typical developing kids would entrain to their interaction partner if individuals with autism or other disabilities are not? Is that a potential red flag that we should look at more closely? Okay, I'm getting done. I had the fortune, again, from the Simons Foundation. This is super ambitious. Put cameras, microphones, and physiological sensors into 20 homes with autism. This is the data set. 406 days, which is 2,030 hours of video from 20 different families, all with autism, 80% of which has a person or motion in the scene. So we're not just looking at empty frames. The audio accompanies those videos. The Q sensor data is giving you physical activity and electrodermal activity, 203 days worth, 300 hours. 75% of those meet criteria for template matching and valid data. It's not missing and it's not completely artifact. And then we have 116 nights of motion, vibration, and ambient light from Sleepwatch with validated algorithms. We are able to now start to do source separation of who are the people in the scene. We have an interface where we can pull in the actual video, a person counter based on the computer vision, motion detection based on how histograms are changing over frames, the accelerometry, so how much motion is happening from the child that's in the scene, their skin temperature, their electrodermal activity, and then we've been playing around with an audio measure where we can essentially subtract the background noise from how much noise we're hearing in that environment. And then this is one of those things that I want to now like crowdsource this. So what could we do? This is so much data. It's very potentially useful for documenting maturational change or intervention outcomes, but it's too much data to efficiently be able to analyze. And if you do only summative variables, metadata, it kind of obviates the whole point of getting so much multivariate and repeated measure. So I think that both the supervised and an unsupervised, and probably some combination thereof, could be really useful here. So could we do unimodal or multimodal data discovery and look for recurrence, and then have the machine show the human who says that is meaningful or not meaningful, or that's what that is. That's a aggression, that's a self-injury, that's an elopement, that's a repetitive movement, and train that classifier to then be able to extract that automatically. Or vice versa, you go in and you have a human do some annotation, it's providing that classifier, it's training on that, and then it can pull it out on its own after. I'll just say I think there's promise in the measures, more quantitative behavioral science, both for research purposes, for clinical purposes, for outcome purposes. Many people help with these studies. Many people fund these studies. And for anybody here or who knows other people, both students and health people with aptitudes for computing or computing backgrounds with interest in health, we want to start educating them. How much farther can those students go than us who came to the second discipline later? I think we need more data literacy in health, and I think we need more computational, we need more knowledge of health and theory in computing. We're getting into an era of generative AI. We have algorithms that we don't really understand how they work and why they work, and have very little transparency and interpretability. I think it's going to be the domain experts in the health condition, and it's going to be the computational person sitting together, collecting data, understanding how the method works, talking about interpretation that's going to bring the full value to society. Thanks.
Great talk.
Thanks.
Very important not to make too much of the, one dyad in the, hi. Great talk. I know at the end, the video that you showed of the clinic situation where there's the examiner and the parent and the child, you cautioned not to make too big a deal about it, 'cause it's just one family, it's preliminary. But I wanted to get your thoughts about the stability of that asynchrony between the parent and the child, because the situation that they're being measured in is sort of triadic, or at least there's two dyads. And I wonder if part of the asynchrony is driven by the presence of the examiner and the parents, assumptions about what the examiner might be thinking and all that. And if that kind of asynchrony that comes out then is representative of other situations where it's just the parent and the child.
Good question. So they're doing a free play, then the reading of a book, then with the parents, and then we have the kind of block the page so they can't turn it. We took a lab tab inspired, the plastic box, ring of keys, they can't get into it. So we were trying to start to play around a little bit of no demand, frustration, some demand is one way that we intend to look across those different conditions and see whether we'll say synchrony. I want to caution us to not always think about synchrony, because synchrony is not always a good thing. I don't know if you've ever argued with your spouse or sibling, or if you both are at the same spot, it's usually not good. It's usually if one's high and one's, but ways to start thinking about within individual over condition, individual differences within group, and then between group differences, I think might be an interesting way to try to parse that out. But then we also have to think about what is the metric, because it's not just going to be correlation over the entire series. It's going to have to probably be onset, offset, duration, magnitude, and directionality. Who's leading and who's following? I mean, these are the things that we're kind of grappling with now, is how do we parameterize this and make the right contrast so that you can make an inference about why you think this is happening. And one of the first things we did that was really I'm glad we thought about it. Our bodies are similarly shaped. Our postures typically are similarly shaped. There's going to be just spurious, it's not even spurious, there's going to be shared variance by virtue of the fact that we have a heart and a body that needs to move, or sweat glands. We took discontinuous data points, randomized them. We falsified dyads extensively through the data set. So we could try to figure out what's the background level of correlation that exists in the data set, so that any now effect size we generate has minused out the shared variance that's already in the data. I don't know the results yet, because we're just starting to, I have a PhD student who's finally said, I will make this my dissertation. So they power everything. But these are some of the things that we think about. It's a super good question. Yeah.
And talking about your offsets, the onset, and you have any data looking at individuals who've gone through behavioral therapies, other medical therapies, treat, and if that's changed the parameters?
Not systematically, no, but that's what I would like to very much see. Part of I don't want to be the only one doing this. I want to figure these methods out, de-risk them, show some utility, and then work with other people so that they can include these measures in their data sets. And we can start, there's so many good questions that I think you can ask when we have a more multi-system quantitative approach, but it's limiting what one lab, one recruitment, how many different kinds of questions you can ask and answer. It sounds like I'm making an excuse. I'm not trying to make an excuse. It's more I think it's time that we start to I think it's time we rely less on brief clinical encounters, clinical summaries, surveys, and start measuring things directly, and then see where they're valuable or not. I don't think it's not a panacea. I mean, you need the right context and you need the right experimental or quasi-experimental conditions to tease out what's the function, what's the precursor? What's the right response and how effective was it? So I want what you are asking.
Quick follow-up question, the individuals who have these cameras and other devices, homes. You know, if any of these individuals are undergoing therapies as well, there's going to be probably a bit of time to start a phase.
This was the, like, we didn't test any hypothesis. I mean, this was like one of those, will a family agree? How long will they leave it in their house? What portion of the data has sufficient enough quality that you could subject it to analysis as a precursor to exactly what you're talking about, which are going to be pharmaceutical and behavioral interventions, where we might supplement measurement in-home observation instead of reliance on what is currently now pre and post survey measures. And there's still a ways to go here, right? Because I'm brushing over the complexity of getting a camera and a microphone and a physiological sensor, sampling at different rates with different interference from broadband, and where do you store all of this and how do you keep it? I mean, this is non-trivial. This is what guys like this do every day, but we in sort of the behavioral studies we're accustomed to doing, what we're trained in the labs, we don't usually have that kind of infrastructure knowledge.
So now we have the data. Let's say this, the deep data from the 2010s. So, like, how long will it take to run? I mean, so it seems to me that it's a great insight to then do something unsupervised, right? You know, do unsupervised, you just need computation. And sure, you could then ask, you know, for the clusters that emerge from the unsupervised, you could ask whether they have, I guess, as human beings, we will ask whether they have meaning. Either you'll do a study of that in which you kind of ask people whether they have meaning, or you just figure it out as an investigator. So how long? What are the obstacles to just getting the hell out of it? This kind of massively longitudinal, multimodal, observational, quantitative data set, because it seems to me that that's going to be faster than, you know, looking for X's.
I agree with you. The biggest barrier so far has been data use agreements between institutions. I don't think it's that we don't know the method. I don't think it's that we don't have the compute power. I don't think it's because we don't have the right team members who are interested in giving it a try. I think are we still broadcasting live?
Yeah. But I think you're safe.
Who's using the data for what purpose? The reasons I collected it and the reasons why people would find it valuable could be very different. If we could anonymize it, that's not easy to do in video. Now, maybe if you can, I mean, here's where we'd have to take a much deeper dive with computer vision folks. Like, if you can abstract it, if you can get skeletons and you feel like they're doing a good job, then maybe you reproduce the video only with that, with all your other data that's available.
Yeah.
Don't know. Yeah.
I mean, what you say, that you can actually abstract the human, you can make it enjoy. The question is how many enjoy you want on the phone, right? But there it's a different problem. Because there where you show every single bone of the body, or you just okay.
That's right.
That way,
That's right.
right? You have temperature, you have the heart rates, flow, blood flow. But in the very part where the data now can become available more people. without any kind of privacy.
Exactly. So I'd like to crowdsource it, I mean, with IRB and with data use for scientists to figure out what level of abstraction can be done, and then what is sufficient then for scientists who want to ask questions about it, and then like make it open.
The other question coming back to that is that a little bit of the question that, because you measure all of these things, do you have an idea of how many of those are most critical and not, or this is patterns or experiments? Because, I mean, we can measure a lot of things and we can measure everything, but is everything
Right, necessary.
necessary
right.
or equally contributing, or you find things that they are more appropriate or will have the maximum effect?
Yeah. I mean, in this case, again, it wasn't hypothesis driven. So, but I certainly have my own, like I was interested in challenging behavior. So what I wanted to know is, do I need to see them? Could I hear them? Could I figure it out by the motion? Could I figure it out by the physiology? Could I figure it out by linear combinations of some of those? That was what was driving me. And one of the first things we did, and we've only just like touched just the surface of it, was I had a couple research assistants annotating what we're calling clinically relevant behavior. So that's sort of anything that, pardon me, but like looks a little autistic versus like not typical. And we had some cases where you have a child with autism and without autism in the same household. And so they're represented in all of these. We could do pretty good differentiation with just like minimal audio, minimal computer vision. I also don't know that you have to track the whole time. I mean, we could subsample out of this data set. It depends on what the resolution of the question that you're asking is.
I mean, there are a set of meta questions. Like you could ask the question, how often do you have to sample? What do the covariance matrices look like? So do we need all the channels?
And you have the complete data, so you don't have to simulate that. You could subsample your own data to answer. And I love the idea of like multicollinearity, because now we can start to say, okay, well, what's the easiest, smallest de-identified file we need to answer our question? Yeah.
And then there'd be different kind of level gamification depending on the question.
Yeah.
What you're saying, so you make it, more and more open, if you will, depending on the question, or more and more restrictive.
Yes.
Depending on the question.
Yes. Yeah. And the significance of like answering that question correctly or incorrectly. Yeah. One of the greatest things, well, I shouldn't say greatest things. One of the nice learnings was families accept it. They were not upset by it. They said, if anything, like, I'm glad the world can see what it's actually like for us. I'm hopeful that someone is consuming this information and can give me something back that is useful. They were not super concerned with privacy in a way that we originally thought they might. Now, this might be highly motivated families who have children with significant impairment. They may not represent other families with autism or non-autism or the general population, but they didn't think we were invasive. They reported that after a while, they just forget about it. In fact, what we would have to do after a while is like have artifacts in the environment that remind them that they're being recorded, or to like take this sensor off and put this sensor on. One of the first passes I have to do is like, let's do a nudity screen. Like we just need to make sure that, and you'd be surprised how many moms and dads are walking around. They forget that it's there. Well, that's a pro and that's a con, and we're going to have to like manage that if we're going to be sharing that with other people.
Okay, so from the chat, then we can begin to wrap up. Great talk. How are folks with ASD in localizing sounds, understanding speech noise environment, and how much that can put up with the potentially behavior?
Sorry, say it again.
Like how much does sound load and maybe kind of auditory overload in general contribute to address behavior?
Great question. I don't know the answer to it. That's a great question.
Thank you for the question.
It'd be curious though to think about how you would maybe find out. Like if you had a decibel reader on the child who engages in the behavior, can you map their audio heard landscape from the rate of their behavior? And then you probably have to manipulate it.
Yeah, we look at kids with cochlear implants, and I remember reading this print application from a guy with a cochlear implant, and basically it's like you have no idea how confusing and auditorial and overwhelming it is. And when you were talking, it made me think, oh, they're both dealing with this sensory issue.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing too, I noticed like kind of clinically is it's unfortunate, right? But children who have sensory sensitivity and who have emotion dysregulation issues and have challenging behaviors are often placed in the same environment because the support staff, we don't have enough support staff to split them up. So you potentially have a kid who is engaging in repetitive vocalizations, right? For some like regulatory purpose, presumably. I like to assume function and then rule it out instead of try to rule it in. So like they're doing this on purpose, and this kid's got an auditory sensitivity. And so they're getting really frustrated, but they can't say like, could you please be quiet or can you please move me? So then they start getting agitated and aggressive. That's going to create a lot of motion and sound. And they're like setting each other off. They're coupled. And we're not like, we don't design our classrooms that way. We don't design our clinics that way. What are they smelling? I mean, these rugs off gas. You start to take the perspective of the individual and you think about these environments that they're in. We might be calling out some of these behaviors.
I want to thank you, Matthew. For
Yeah,
your talk.
yeah, my pleasure. And I can end it here, should I? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.